Well, hello, students. We are already into week 7. Would you believe that? One more week after this, and we're all in the mail. But it's really been a pleasure working with all of you. And I must admit that the threads have been outstanding. Um, we have some very knowledgeable individuals out there, and you're all from many different fields. It made the threads really very enriched with super knowledge coming from so many different cultures. Uh, anyway, now we are into chapters 14 and 15. And I'm going to spend 3 days on chapter 14 and 4 days on chapter 15. Chapter 14 is about conflict and negotiation, and chapter 15 is on the foundations of organizational structure. And really, in order to truly understand systems and processes as far as culture is concerned, you really need to understand the structure. If you will, to draw an analogy to an organization, the structure is kind of the hardware. The software is the people. They kind of decide how the culture is going to be built and how all of the moving parts will satisfy the strategic plan. Anyway, let's start with conflict. You know, we all know about conflict, okay? We'll talk about that. That's chapter 14. And obviously, when there's conflict and we realize that we can at least agree to disagree, then we can have some very meaningful negotiations. You know, when you have conflict, different points of view, somebody has to give something up, somebody has to gain something on both sides, kind of like a contract. And if we continue to have loggerheads, we continue to butt heads against one another, conflict will never be resolved. In fact, it can only get worse. And as we know, when conflict gets worse, you stifle productivity, you stifle efficiency. And it very truly affects in so many different ways when you stifle productivity and efficiency. You are losing your branding, your image to those that buy your products and services. And eventually, you know, when conflict gets so bad, you could even lose your business. So, anyway, in this chapter, we're going to realize that managers and organizations need to be able to effectively deal with conflict. We all know that at all levels, whether you're in the strategic, tactical, or operational part of the company, you have to deal with conflict. And the thing is that dealing with conflict, we need to develop skill sets toward our ability to be able to negotiate individual problems in such a way that we don't hurt the branding of the company or we don't effectively damage how we do business that has always worked for us. The chapter objectives are going to be, and this is chapter 14, to describe the three types of conflict and the three loci of conflict. We're going to talk about the conflict process. You know, what do we go through? And we're going to talk about different types of bargaining in order to resolve the problems. And we're going to talk about what we refer to as integrative bargaining. We're going to apply the 5 steps of the negotiation process of resolving conflict and how individual differences are going to influence negotiations. We want to look at some of the social factors that influence negotiations, and then we want to assess the roles and functions of third party negotiations. So that's kind of what we're going to do in chapter 14. Excuse me, getting a little dry here. Let's move on to what's going to be happening with 15, the last 4 days of this particular week. Need a little water to, clear the vocal cords here. So let's talk about organizational structure in chapter 15. This chapter is going to examine some of the different ways in which organizations can be structured for maximum effectiveness. We all know that when communication flows from the top down and the bottom up and laterally, in other words, when communication flows 360 degrees in the company, it's most effective. How, if we do a SWOT analysis on our organization, what are we effectively looking at? We're looking at strengths and weaknesses internally to adapt to changes externally to threats and opportunities. Learned that a long time ago, right? So this chapter is going to look at that structure inside and see how we're able to adapt to the changes that are needed on the outside of the company and the external environment so that we don't lose our competitive edge. So these chapter objectives are going to be to identify the 7 elements of an organization's structure and the characteristics of what we refer to as functional structure, divisional structure, and matrix structure. Don't get too hung up on it now. We're going to go in depth on the days to follow with structure, the different types of structure. But we want also to, in this chapter, identify the characteristics of what we refer to as the virtual organization, the team structure, and the circular structure. We're going to also look at about downsizing. What are some of the effects of downsizing on organizational structures and employees? We all know when we downsize, a lot of employees tend to do a lot more extra work to compensate for those that are no longer with the company. Is this a good or a bad thing? We have to weigh that as we go through this chapter. And the other thing is we want to contrast the reasons for mechanistic and organic structural models. We want to finally analyze the behavioral implications of different organizational designs. If we rearrange how we do business internally, it might help the overall efficiency of the organization, or too many changes too rapidly might have problems with the internal structure, and we can't adapt to the needed changes in our external environment. So these are the things that we're going to be looking at over the next several days. And as always, if you need to reach out to me for any reason, you know how to get me on my cell.